but a person who studies the Bible very carefully and uses historical and outside sources as well to verify, the biblical witness. And he's written tons and tons of books. The best one, I think, is he wrote an introduction to the New Testament that I have. It's a thick thing like that. So I'm not sure you'd be interested in it. But he's quite a guy, and he's got a podcast, Ask NT Wright Anything. I think once a week or something like that. My son Eric actually saw him when he was in Hong Kong. He came over to Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to belong to Britain at one point. So there's Anglican churches in Hong Kong. And my son Eric attended the Anglican cathedral that is there. They had invited NT Wright over to give the lectures and to give the sermon. And so Eric had a chance to hear him when he was there. So he wrote a book. This is not new. I think this goes to 2000. I was looking at the copyright. It's 2006, first published in 2006. So it's not new. 2006, gosh, that seems like eons ago now at this point. But it's intended to be an introduction to the Christian faith, both for Christians and for non-Christians. So it's what we call an apologetic book. Apologetics simply means a book that explains what the Christian faith is to people who are interested in inquiring into it to find out more about it. Okay, it's not making apologies for being a Christian, it's explaining what it is. All right, so that's what the book is. And so it's in a line of books. There have been, hundreds of books like this written throughout the centuries. Its nearest cousin would be C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, which most of you have probably heard of. So it's a little bit like that, but he has a different take. Okay, he comes at it in a different way. So what I'm going to do today first is explain how the book is organized and why it's organized in that way. And hopefully we'll get into the first section. The book is divided up into 3 sections, okay? All right, so let me start by telling you a story that will help illustrate what the first section is about. As most of you may know, Kirsten and I this summer decided to take a vacation in South Dakota. She had never seen the Black Hills or the Badlands. And I had gone there as a kid. My parents used to take us camping all over the place. So when you're living in North Dakota, you're within driving distance of a lot of different places. Yellowstone, Glacier, the Tetons, Black Hills, and so forth. So I'd been there. But in any case, as we were planning the trip, it became clear to me that Kirsten and I have a different way of approaching something like a trip someplace, okay? She wanted to make extremely organized, all right? So each day would be laid laid out. Okay, so day one, we're going to go here and here and here. Day two, so she bought a bunch of guidebooks and maps and all this stuff from Amazon. She wanted to have it all, figured out. My approach to trips is more muddled. I just like to go. And then when I get there, spontaneously decide what I'm going to do. So we had two different approaches. But for the sake of marital harmony, she won out, okay? So we followed her plan, which worked just fine, of course. But maybe a better example of of the point I want to make here is the difference between my oldest brother, Clint, and me, okay? My oldest brother, who is now retired in Florida, he's 7 years older than me, which makes him 73. So at the age of 16, he was already a manager in a grocery store. He was an extremely ambitious guy, all right? And he knew exactly what he wanted in life. So one day I asked him, "What's your goal, Clint? What's your plan for your life?" He said, "One day I want to be a CEO and make a company successful. That's my plan." Okay. So me, on the other hand, I barely muddled through high school. The high school gave me a social promotion just to get rid of me. They didn't want to deal with me anymore, or my friends for that matter. I mean, me and my friends were a little off color. We were kind of that group over there. Let me put it this way. We were basically just a bunch of pot smoking. My goal in life was to drive my muscle car to the A&W drive-in so I could show it off and order a pizza burger. That was, if I had that, that was all I needed, right? Clint, on the other hand, because he had this goal of becoming a CEO, he decided that the Bay Area was the place to live because there's just so many startups around here. So he moves to the South Bay in his early 20s. He moved to Los Gatos. And I was still in high school at the time, but he moved to Los Gatos. He got his first job. He started right away with Dow Chemical. And he was doing very well.
Yeah.
When I graduated from high school, on the other hand, I had no goal, none whatsoever. So my parents are very concerned about, where I was going to end up. What's this kid going to be? How's he going to navigate life? Because he doesn't know what he's doing. So they called my brother and they asked if I could move in with him. And he said, fine, he can come out, let him come out. So one very cold November day, this was one of those days when a front came down from Canada over the top of us. It was a blizzard, November 2nd, and it was a blizzard, okay? But I got in my GTO and I set out for Los Gatos. Once I got here, to make a long story short, let me first tell you how Clint's life unfolded. Okay, he eventually went to various different companies and And when he was, I don't know, in his 50s at some point, he was asked to become the CEO of a company that was struggling. Its name was Abaxis. And they sold diagnostic machines, both for veterinarians and for doctors. They were small, portable diagnostic machines. Okay, so you could take a blood sample and right on the spot, you could diagnose if a person had a particular virus or, you know, what their hemoglobin was or whatever, okay? So he turned the company around, right? It became extremely successful. My oldest son, Eric, who was hired, and he worked for the European branch of the company, so he moved to Germany first. Then he was promoted to take over the Asian part of the company, which is why he lived in Hong Kong, right? But when Clint reached the age of 70, a company by the name of Zoetis, which is a multinational company that makes medicine for animals, extremely successful company. Okay, their stock is worth hundreds of dollars. Do you remember those commercials about that cream that you could put on your dog? If your dog had an itch, you'd put a cream on and it would stop the itch. There used to be a lot of commercials about it. I remember it because it was a Chinese pug who talked to its owner. Anyway, Zoetis makes that. That's one of the medicines that made this company rich. Okay, they wanted to buy my brother's company, Abaxis. So they negotiated with Clint for a long time because Clint, he was not going to sell that company unless they paid a very high price. Now, the stock at the time was trading for $50 a share. He told them that if they wanted to buy Abaxis, they were going to have to pay $80 a share, $30 above what it was trading for. No, we're not going to do that. Forget it. And then a few days later, they called him and accepted the deal. Okay, now he owns most of the shares of the company, so you can imagine what he got out of that deal, right? So he took his bundle and moved to Florida, which is a no-tax state, and bought a house in a community built by the Disney Corporation called Celebration. But he's there only part of the year. He's there in the summer. He's also got 2 condos in Manhattan and 2 condos in my hometown of Minot. And he's got 22 properties in Santa Clara County. All right. And he plays with the stock market. That's how he spends his time. And he makes probably several $1 million a year just on dividends. Okay, so he's doing okay. Me, on the other hand, okay, I move out here and I have no idea what I'm going to do. Okay, but eventually I end up at a community college, West Valley College in Saratoga. And I didn't know what to study, so I just took business classes because my dad was an insurance guy and my brother was in business, but they bored me to tears. I couldn't, no way. And then one day I was walking through the library and they had on display a book by the philosopher Plato. It was Plato's Republic. And the cover intrigued me. So I picked up the book and I started reading it. And that book changed my life. At that point, I became so interested in philosophy and theology and all the rest of it that I changed my major and studied, all the humanities. Eventually ended up at St. Olaf College. That's where I met Kirsten. And to make a long story short, circumstances suggested I was being called into the ministry. And so I spent my first 12 years newly married. We had two boys, and those were the happiest years of my life. It was just, having those two boys was, well, any of you have had children know, but it's just, I was never happier than when I had those two boys. Okay. So anyway, the difference between the two of us is that Clint knew where he was going his entire life, and he got there. He met every goal he ever set. I just muddled through. I didn't know where I was going, what I was going to do, when it was going to happen. Circumstances led this way, that way, the other way. Eventually, I ended up what I am. Okay. So, the book, Simply Christian, represents Clint's way of doing things, okay? He has a specific goal in mind, all right? But the way he goes about it is that he starts with the end. In other words, if you think about the story as it's told in the Bible, okay, the story, we call it the story of salvation, all right? The Bible is a story. The main character is God, and the theme is how God is going to put everything to rights. God is going to redeem the world. That's the theme of the Bible as a book. Okay, now there's all different kinds of literature in the Bible. Of course, there's poetry, there's proverbs, there's prophecy, there's, but it all fits together. Okay, so like, for example, at the end of the Old Testament, you've got all these prophecies of how God is going to redeem the world. But the Old Testament never tells you when or how this is going to happen. It just leaves you hanging. With Isaiah saying, one day we'll turn swords into plowshares, and no one will hurt again on my holy mountain, and everything will be redeemed and restored and refreshed and made right. And all the injustices of the world will be done away with, okay? Everything will be as human beings would want it to be, all right? That's how the Old Testament ends. But that's where the New Testament fits in, because the New Testament is the fulfillment of what the Old Testament says is going to happen. Okay, the New Testament is the story of how God finally acts to redeem his creation by sending his son into the world and revealing God as God really is, dying on the cross, rising again, giving us a picture of what the future is going to look like for all people. So So the Bible is a story about salvation. It's a story about how God eventually is going to redeem his creation. Now, a lot of people think the Bible is about how I'm going to get to heaven, but that's not really what it's about, okay? Because the Bible isn't about going somewhere else. The Bible is about how God is going to redeem the creation we live in right now. That's what it's about. Okay, now that doesn't mean there isn't a heaven. There is a heaven. God is in heaven. But heaven isn't a place. Heaven is a state of being. Okay, and the book of Revelation, for example, ends by saying the New Jerusalem descends out of heaven onto earth. And the symbolism of that is that the creation will eventually be redeemed and all things put to rights, all things made whole, and as God wants them to be, okay? So that's where NT Wright starts his book. Part 1 is about the goal of the story of the Bible. Where does the Bible say we're going? What is God up to? What is he doing? What is his goal, right? Just like my brother, he had a goal, he knew where he was going, and he eventually got there. Well, what about God? What is his goal? What is he up to? And where are we going according to God's plan for creation? That's where NT Wright starts his book. Okay, so part 1 is about where we're headed. Part 2 is about how God actually accomplishes that. Okay, and part 2 is where we get into his interpretation of the biblical text, where he talks about the meaning of the cross, the meaning of the resurrection, his interpretation of the Bible and of how God redeems creation. That's the second part. The third part of the book, okay, so if you think about how the story of the Bible unfolds, okay, the Old Testament is about how God chooses a specific people to be his agents. The Hebrew people, the chosen people, are to be his agents in the story of salvation. They're to be the people whose lives reflect the living God, the one God who actually has created all things. Okay, that is their role. That is why they were chosen, all right? In the New Testament, a new community is formed. And that new community is the community formed around faith in Jesus Christ. In other words, the church, all right? And I just want to say a few words about the church. Because there is some misunderstanding about where Christianity really is in the world right now. Okay, Christianity in the past was always identified with Western civilization, because Western civilization is where Christianity emerged. Okay, and Western Europe was Christendom for years. All right, that's not the case anymore. Okay, Christianity. So critics of the Christian faith oftentimes, for example, when the United States decided to invade both Afghanistan and Iraq, critics of the Christian faith saw that as the Christian world making war on the Islamic world. But the fact of the matter is that Western governments did not have the goal of pushing Christianity in a non-Christian country. We did have the unfortunate goal of trying to create democracies in countries that never had democracies, and we failed, okay? Because it's a completely different culture, right? But it wasn't Christianity that was making war on Islam. It was Western powers who were doing that. Okay, so today the Christian faith is strongest. Okay, in Europe it's almost gone. In the U.S. there are enclaves of Christianity still, but their influence is fading and shrinking. Where Christianity is strong and growing is Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, and China. That's where Christianity is growing, okay? In the United States and in Europe, it continues to shrink, all right? So Christianity is still the largest religion in the world, but its strength is no longer in Western societies. Its strength is in Africa, Southeast Asia, and it'll be very interesting to find out, because in China, Christianity is growing underground, mostly. There are official churches that are allowed by the Communist Party, but most of Christianity is underground. And it's going to be fascinating to find out, as it rapidly grows, which it is, how Chinese society is going to eventually have to allow for the emergence of the Christian church. Because eventually, you know, it's going to be like a spring of water. Eventually, it's just going to burst like this because it's growing so fast. And political parties are not going to be able to stop it, you know, at some point, keep it underground. You know, the NT Wright has this story. This is interesting because it helps illustrate what's going on. He says, once upon a time, there was a dictator, okay? And this dictator wanted to govern his country in a rational way, okay? And make everything just right for the citizens of his country. So, you know, he controlled the economy. He made sure everything happened exactly the way it should. Everybody was provided for, you know, but at the same time, you got to remember there was no freedom here. Nobody was free to do what they wanted to do. They had to do what the dictator said. But the dictator in return would make sure that they were provided for, right? Well, this particular country had a problem with springs of water, okay? So oftentimes these springs, which were all over the place, would burst up and they would flood areas, and they would damage property, and you know, it was a nuisance. So he decided he was going to have to fix this problem. So he decided to cover all the springs in feet of concrete to keep them from bursting, right? And then he created a system of pipes to get water to everybody, right? And At first the population kind of missed the springs because the springs, it was fresh water and children could play in the water, and they kind of missed the springs, even though once in a while they caused floods. But at the same time, they thought, well, this dictator has our best interests at heart. He really wants to make sure that there's no damage to our property, that water is provided for in a rational way with the system of pipes, and he even put chemicals in the water that would make people more healthy. Okay, but this lasted for about a generation. And then one day there was almost like an earthquake because the concrete couldn't hold the water pressure anymore. And it burst. And the water flowed all over the place. Okay. NT Wright told this story as an illustration of what he calls spirituality. Water is the spirituality in the hearts of human beings. Our yearning to be connected to something beyond ourselves. Our yearning to be connected to something that we can count on, that is changeless, that is life-giving, and that frees us from the problem of sin, evil, and guilt. That's spiritual. The human heart yearns to be connected. There's not a society on the planet that did not have some kind of religion. Because human beings by nature are spiritual creatures. We want to be connected to something beyond ourselves. All right, so eventually it's going to be interesting to see what happens in places like China, because the longing for spirituality at some point is going to burst through the attempts of people to push it down and to stop it from becoming, out of control. Okay, so China is a society where the government wants to be in control. Eric, when he lived in Hong Kong, he lived through the protests. Remember those? What those protests were about was that China had passed a new law. You see, in Hong Kong, the justice system is the same as it is in Britain. It's common law. Right? So if you're accused of a crime, you are entitled to a just trial. Okay? You're not going to be just thrown into jail for political reasons or some reason just because the government doesn't like what you're doing. All right, so the Chinese government passed a law that made Hong Kong citizens subject to Chinese law. That's what those protests were about. Okay, so Eric was there at the time, and Eric also did a lot of business. He went to China. He's been to Shanghai. His best friend is a Chinese guy, and so he's been all over. And he describes how the Chinese government has control of everything. Okay, it knows what all of its citizens are doing, even though there's over 1 billion people using technology. They know what everybody's doing. Now, you might you might wonder whether or not our government is doing the same thing. I don't know. The National Security Administration has the ability to listen in to every cell phone call there is. They do. Okay. I don't know if they're listening in or not, but they have the capability. The Chinese really are listening in. All right. So at some point, it's going to be interesting to see whether or not this spiritual renewal that's going on underground, whether or not that's going to burst through the attempts to keep it under control. All right. Okay, so back to the book. Where NT Wright starts is where the story of salvation is going to end. Okay, but he doesn't approach that from the point of view of the biblical text. He approaches it from the point of view of human aspirations and values. All right. He calls them signposts. In other words, human beings have certain aspirations, and he thinks those aspirations are echoes of the voice of God deep within us, deep within every one of us. Okay, so he identifies four. All right, they are the first one is the longing for justice or putting the world to rights. The second one is spirituality. He calls it the hidden spring. The third one is relationships. We are made for each other. Human beings are social creatures. One of the problems during the lockdown was that some people became isolated and devoid of contact with other people, especially if you lived in a nursing home, right? No one was allowed in there. So I could not imagine if my mother was alive during the pandemic, how she could have dealt with that. Because the only thing she had at the end of her life was visits from her kids. That's all she looked forward to. And if she was deprived of that, I can't imagine how she would have felt. I just can't imagine it. I think she would have just died. So we are made for each other. That's the third one. The fourth one is beauty. Human beings love beautiful things. We go to places like the Grand Tetons, Sequoia National Park, which now is being threatened by a fire, unfortunately. I can't imagine those redwoods burning. I mean, what a catastrophe. Yosemite Valley, Glacier National Park. Have you ever been to the Sun Highway? Yeah, it is absolutely spectacular. Okay, when people see these things, they're bowled over. And oh my goodness, look at this. And the Grand Tetons are like that too. So, and I personally love classical music. So we're patrons of the San Francisco Symphony. Each year, they have a program where if you buy up to 3 concerts, you get a discount for the 3 concerts you go to. Okay, my favorite composer is Beethoven. So Kirsten and I looked through, and sure enough, this year we're getting Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, we're getting his Fifth Symphony, and we're going to go to the Messiah. Those three. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. I mean, and when we're sitting there listening to that symphony play that music, you just get lost in it. It just carries me away, right? Okay, so beauty is another of those things that touches us deep within our souls and our hearts. Okay, so ask yourself the question, where do these things come from? Okay, let's start with justice. Okay, that's the first one. All you have to do to know that human beings long for what is fair and what is just is to attend the preschool class. Go to a preschool class sometime. Eventually, what you're going to hear from those kids is, that's not fair. Right? That's what you're going to hear. Okay? It's just built into us. Those kids weren't taught what is fair and what isn't. They know it by nature. Right? So if one kid is treated better than the rest of them, they're going to see that right away. They don't have to be taught that that's not right. Okay? So the longing for justice is one of those human aspirations that Wright identifies as what he calls echoes of a voice from beyond ourselves. It's echoes of the voice of God deep within us. All right, a couple of examples. Now, the Christian church throughout the years has not been perfect. We all know that. There have been instances when the Christian church has violated the rights of other people in some pretty bad ways, all right? There's the Crusades, there's the Spanish Inquisition, there's the way native peoples were treated when the European powers came here. There's all kinds of examples, all right? But at the same time, okay, if you're going to accuse Christianity of being the culprit, the mistake you're making is this. The behavior of people who violate the rights of others also violates the Christian faith as presented in the New Testament. So it isn't Christianity that's violating, it's people who may claim Christianity, but they are not reflecting it as it is. They are violating it. Okay? Jesus would not do those things. And Jesus preached against those things, as did the prophets. Okay, so what I like to do when I think about the issue of justice and the Christian faith is to look at examples where Christians changed whole societies on the basis of their faith. And I can think right off the top of my head, because I lived through them, of two examples. Consider what happened in South Africa. Remember apartheid? Okay. The world was, eventually got fed up and said, you have to change. All right. It wasn't going to be tolerated anymore. Okay. Now, a lot of people advocated violence, a violent revolution. But the guy who eventually emerged and changed that society was a bishop by the name of Desmond Tutu. Remember him? And how did he do that? He established what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in a nonviolent way, changed the whole society and established justice in a way that avoided bloodshed, violence, and mayhem. And he did that all on the basis of his Christian faith. That's how he did it. All right. So that's an example of how Christianity and the issue of putting the world to rights has come together and been a shining example of that. Okay. The other one, of course, is our own Martin Luther King Jr. here in the US. Okay. He was a pastor. I don't know how many books he wrote, but I bought one of his books. And the name of the book was Love. It was about love. Okay? So Dr. King, as a Christian, wanted to work for justice for Black Americans in this country. But he didn't want to violate his own Christian faith at the same time. He didn't want to advocate violence. So he instituted what he called the nonviolent protest movement. And there were times when these nonviolent protesters were abused by the police and by, people who were against what they were doing. But eventually, because of his inspiring speeches and the force of his faith as it came through, like his I Have a Dream speech, eventually that led to the Civil Rights Act and finally doing away with Jim Crow laws in the South. So there's another example. Okay. Now, human beings by nature long for fair and just social orders. And we also, now there are normally two major questions that people raise when they're thinking about our longing for a just, peaceful, fair place where everybody has the opportunity to flourish. That's what we want. Unfortunately, that has eluded us down through the years, okay? Violent dictators like Adolf Hitler have arisen and gotten power. The same with Stalin and others. And we ask the question of things like the Holocaust, how could this happen? How could God allow that to happen? 6 million people? It boggles the imagination, okay? And people also ask why there are natural disasters. Think about the people who live in the Gulf states in this country. All of the hurricanes that they have suffered through the last couple of years. They just keep coming and coming and coming. And people wonder, why is this? Okay, so we look for reasons, right? And unfortunately, sometimes human beings, because we get so angry at the way things are, sometimes we try to identify a scapegoat, something or somebody to blame, right? And then that's when things can get dangerous and violent. Okay, because when people identify something or someone to blame for disorder and injustice in the social world, that gets dangerous because people can get violent. Okay, so that's the reason I raised both the example of Martin Luther King Jr. and Desmond Tutu, because they were able to make those changes without violence. And actually, when you think about it, they were more effective in making sure that change happened through a nonviolent method than anyone who's tried to use violence instead. NT Wright thinks that our longing for putting the world to rights, as he puts it, making things just and fair and peaceful, where people live in freedom and where human beings can flourish. That is the echo of a voice deep within us. Now, that same voice comes through in the Hebrew prophets. The Hebrew prophets called for justice over and over and over again. Amos, let justice and righteousness flow like an everlasting stream. And Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel ended their prophetic careers by saying that God eventually was going to make a new covenant. And in the new covenant, everything would be put to rights. And the world would become a peaceful, just, and fair place where everybody would flourish. That is God's goal for human beings. And we hear that voice deep within us. And NT Wright thinks that voice comes from God. Okay, we're out of time. We'll pick it up then next week with the three other signposts, which he says are human aspirations that reflect the voice of God deep within us. That is spirituality, relationships, and beauty. Okay, any questions or comments?
Thank you.
Was that understandable? Yeah.
Another one you might bring up is somewhat older. But when the Spaniards first came to the world, they were very full of themselves, of course,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
we all are.
Yeah.
But there was one thing that they had that was difficult to combat, and that is that they were unable to see because the indigenous peoples were so foreign, so un-Spanish, that, I mean, they had lots and lots of nasty little habits. That a lot of the Spaniards thought that in effect they were like animals. So if the snake, comes at you, kill it.
Yeah.
Don't try to reason with it or cop with it, kill it. But that was also used for people.
Mhm.
because they were not considered to be human. There was a man who came to Cortes, whose name was Bartolomeo de los Casas, priest, a monk. And he said, no, these are people. They have souls. God loves them like he loves us. And what we should do is convert them to Christianity so that they can see. And he especially affected so that he colored the Spanish attitude towards indigenous people. I think that's one of the reasons why the church is strong in South America.
Oh, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
Because
Yeah.
one man said,
Yeah. Right.
people,
Right.
they have souls.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it was the same thing with the abolitionists during the slavery. You know, because the people who owned slaves justified it on the base of racial inferiority. Same thing Hitler did, you know, with the Jews. So the abolitionists in the North, especially in New England, said, no, these are human beings, just like you. You can't own a human being.
Well, that's why Martin Luther King, I have a dream that one day my children will be known by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And they recite it. And it doesn't matter whether the color of their skin is black or white. You can't take them on either count.
Right. Yeah, that was his Christian faith coming through. Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah. I'm sure there's a lot of other examples that we could use. Thank you all for coming. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thanks, Jerry and Sharon and Heidi.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay.